Hello and welcome back to Intro to American Studies. This week we are reading a chapter from May Ngai's amazing book called Impossible Subjects, Illegal Aliens, and the Making of Modern America. This book has totally transformed my understanding of America and Americans because Ngai shows how laws about U.S. citizenship have been written and changed over and over again in order to produce and preserve the idea that America is a white nation. She writes about Filipino, Mexican, Japanese, and Chinese migration, but I decided to give you Chapter 3 on Filipino migration for two reasons. One is to include the stories of a group of people that we have not talked about yet, and also because the Filipino-American story reveals the nature of American empire and imperialism. So if you have not understood the U.S. to be an empire before reading this, you probably will after. Important background to this chapter is what Ngai calls Asiatic exclusion, and she's using the language that the US government used, which is, yes, racist language. So what was Asiatic exclusion? Basically, in the 19th century, many Chinese folks migrated to the US because there was a need for cheap labor, and anti-Chinese racism grew to such a point that in 1882, the U.S. passed its very first immigration restriction law, which was called the Chinese Exclusion Act. And this act banned almost all Chinese people from immigrating to the U.S., and it banned Chinese folks who are already here, but not citizens, from becoming citizens. And I want to emphasize that it was the first immigration restriction law because before that, believe it or not, there were barely any restrictions on immigrating to this country. There were always racialized restrictions on who could become a citizen, but there were not many limits on who could physically enter and live in the country. And a lot of this had to do with need for cheap labor and need to colonize and further settle the land. So this is why Ngai calls her book The Making of Modern America, because this idea of restricting immigration is a pretty modern idea produced in the late 19th and 20th centuries to control what this country looked like and who could flourish here. And so in Chapter 3, Ngai is talking about Filipino migration experiences, but it is important to understand that Filipinos were showing up in United States that had already almost completely banned Chinese people from entering because of anti-Chinese racism. So even though most Filipino people do not have Chinese ancestry, most white people did not know or care about this difference and ended up lumping Filipinos into their racist idea of Asian people. So Ngai basically does four things in this chapter, and I will admit that the language is dense at times, so if you're struggling with it, no worries. Hopefully my explanation will help. So first, she shows how the U.S. colonized the Philippines. So last week we talked about how the U.S. fought Mexico and conquered much of its territory, and a few years later the U.S. went to war against Spain and ended up conquering formerly Spanish territory, most notably Puerto Rico, which is still a U.S. colony, as we discussed in Unit 1, and the Philippines. And she shows how this was a bit of a problem for the U.S. government because the U.S. likes to see itself as the land of the free, right? And so how does the land of the free conquer other people? Well, in the case of Mexico, there weren't a ton of people living in those areas yet, right? What is now Southern California, Arizona, New Mexico, Texas. And so the U.S. government basically gave white immigrants free land to move, settle there, increase the population of white people, and then they could become states, and it was all good. But in the case of Puerto Rico and the Philippines, there were already a ton of people living there, and the U.S. government was not about to add a couple of states full of people they saw as not white to the country. So the Supreme Court invented this idea of an unincorporated territory and a U.S. national so that the U.S. government could benefit economically from having access to more markets and resources and militarily from having more overseas military bases, but at the same time not have to give the people of Puerto Rico or the Philippines equal rights as U.S. citizens. And Americans really convinced themselves that this was okay. So listen to this quote that Ngai gives from the president at the time, who was William McKinley. Quote, "We come not as invaders or conquerors, but as friends to protect the natives in their homes, in their employments, and in their personal and religious rights. The mission of the United States is one of benevolent assimilation." End quote. So the U.S. president is saying to the Filipino people, don't worry, we're not conquering you. We're doing this to help you, so you can become civilized like us. And so you can see the racism embedded in that statement, and it's very similar to how the U.S. government treated the various Native American tribes and nations, right, in conquering North America. And of course, this is not what most Filipino people wanted. In fact, they had already been in the process of fighting for their independence against Spain, right? Then the U.S. comes in and, right, takes over the role that Spain had as the imperial power. So the U.S. then ends up in another war, the Philippine-American War, in which the U.S. military murders tens of thousands of Filipino people in order to not conquer them. So number one, the U.S. colonizes the Philippines while pretending it's not colonizing the Philippines. Number two, Ngai shows how an unintended consequence of this colonization is that Filipinos, as U.S. nationals, could freely migrate to the U.S. So they didn't have the same rights as citizens, but they also were legally part of the U.S., right? This new category of U.S. national. So they didn't have to, apply for immigration and whatnot. So they're recruited by various businesses as low-wage labor, just as Chinese folks were before them. And so just as happened with Chinese people, the more Filipino people that migrated, the more anti-Filipino violence they faced. And I think one of the most masterful things about this chapter is Ngai shows how the reasons white people gave for their dislike of Filipino people, they were stealing their jobs or bringing wages down, were simply not true. In fact, white workers did not want the low-wage agricultural and menial labor jobs that Filipino people were taking. And with regard to wages, Ngai shows how Filipino workers organized and went on strikes to prevent bosses from undercutting white people's wages. But white workers refused to join forces with Filipino workers in this fight. And so Ngai shows how the only real reason that white workers were attacking Filipino workers was racism. She acknowledged that many white workers may have really believed these lies about job and wage competition, but they were lies, and we hear these same lies used to attack many immigrant groups today. Number 3. Ngai shows how another reason white folks gave for attacking Filipino migrants was that they didn't like them fraternizing with white women. And so they had to change the laws around interracial marriage, which are also called anti-miscegenation laws, to prevent Filipino men from marrying white women. So again, Ngai's bigger point is that laws are used to change how people are racially categorized and to criminalize their behavior. So before intermarriage laws were changed, there were Filipino men that married white women. But then the new law defined Filipinos as an inferior race and retroactively made prior Filipino white marriages illegal. So if you had married legally, now after the fact, your marriage was illegal. And why did white folks care so much about interracial marriage? So-called interracial marriage? Well, because ultimately, if people of a variety of backgrounds could freely marry and have kids, then this whole made-up idea of there being a pure white race would disappear over time, right? With all of these babies that come from a variety of backgrounds. And then, if you don't have the fiction of a pure white race, then one group of people can't dominate the others using racist laws and policies. So, So laws around interracial marriage are actually really fundamental, right, to the production and preservation of whiteness in the U.S. And as an aside, it was completely legal to ban interracial marriage until 1967, which is when civil rights activists finally pushed the Supreme Court to rule those laws unconstitutional. So that's 1967, about 50 years ago. I'm sure many of your parents, grandparents were alive, and it was still illegal in some states to marry people of a so-called another race. So number 3, sexuality was used to further oppress and control Filipino people, particularly men, because the majority of laborers who had migrated were men. Number 4, by the 1930s, all of this anti-Filipino racism had gotten to the point that a good number of white people were like, we got to get these guys out of here. And they realized that the only way to legally do that was to end the U.S. colonization of the Philippines. So they had gotten themselves in this mess. Now they needed to get themselves out of it. And so, ironically, many Americans, white Americans, start advocating for Filipino independence. And sometimes they used the same sort of flimsy economic arguments about jobs and wages as before, but often they were just explicitly racist. So here's another quote from the California Joint Immigration Committee. Quote, "This government as founded was then a government of and for the white race. And it was, I think, with the thought and hope of its founders that it would continue to be the government of the whites." End quote. Nowadays, people generally don't use such explicitly racist language to oppose immigration, but they did in the 1930s, again, not even 100 years ago. And so finally, the US government passes the Philippines Independence Act of 1934, which suddenly changed the status of Filipino people from US nationals to foreign nationals. And so then the government could deport people. And so again, the people didn't change, right? They didn't break any immigration or citizenship laws. The laws changed to now criminalize them as non-citizens after they had already migrated here. And the US government wanted to get rid of Filipinos so badly that they even offered to pay for them to return to the islands. But most did not take them up on this offer. So when Ngai talks about repatriation, this is what she's talking about. That's a word that means to return someone to another country. And Ngai makes it clear that while this Independence Act did eventually lead to Filipino political independence, the U.S. maintained the right to freely trade its goods in the Philippines and to establish military bases in the Philippines. And so this is what Ngai calls neo-colonialism or new colonialism, which is based not on direct political control of another country, but on maintaining economic and military control. And the video I had you watch at the beginning of this unit about how America became a superpower shows how this neo-colonial strategy has been used around the world to increase U.S. wealth and power. So hopefully you can clearly see how intersectional Ngai's analysis is. She's talking about race and sexuality and citizenship and other layers of discrimination that I didn't even go into in this short talk. And hopefully you can also see how transnational her analysis is, because she's showing how the very borders of the United States were changed to incorporate various overseas possessions and then to give them up, at least partially, when it was no longer socially or politically convenient. And this book is really considered a model for transnational scholarship. So as usual, your reflections are due Sunday at midnight. Don't forget to answer all 3 of the reflection questions, and I will see you next week for our last reading.